I remember the weight of the neural crown as they lowered it onto my skull for the first time, the cold metal pressing against my shaven scalp like the Emperor's own judgment. The preparation chamber reeked of sacred oils and ozone, the smell so thick I could taste it on my tongue, metallic and bitter, like blood mixed with incense. My hands trembled as the tech priests made their final adjustments to the interface cables, their mechadendrites clicking and whirring in the dim red light that bathed everything in the color of spilled blood. I had dreamed of this moment for 15 years, ever since the Collegia Titanica recruiters had descended upon our hive city's upper spires, their servo skulls scanning crowds for signs of the rare neural compatibility required to interface with a god machine. The tests had been brutal weeks of psychological conditioning, genetic screening, and neural mapping that left my brain feeling raw and exposed. But I had endured, driven by visions of myself striding across battlefields in a towering war engine, bringing the Emperor's wrath to the enemies of mankind. The Warhound-class Titan Ferrum Dolor stood before me in the assembly bay, its void shields crackling with barely contained energy. Even powered down, the machine radiated an aura of terrible purpose that made my bones ache. Its carapace bore the scars of a dozen campaigns' plasma burns that had cooled to twisted metal, impacts from macro-cannon shells that had merely dented its adamantine hide. The princeps had told me that Ferrum Dolor had walked for 3 centuries, its machine spirit seasoned by countless battles across the galaxy's endless wars. "Remember," Princeps Mordain had said during our final briefing, his augmetic eye clicking as it focused on me, "the machine spirit of a Titan is not merely a collection of circuits and cogitators, it is a fragment of the Omnissiah's will made manifest, and it will test you. Some candidates are rejected immediately, the machine simply refuses to acknowledge their presence. Others are consumed by the experience. The neural link can overwhelm an unprepared mind, leaving nothing but a drooling shell connected to tons of ceramite and steel." I had nodded confidently then, secure in my training and my faith. The Mechanicus had spent years preparing me for this moment, flooding my mind with catechisms and technical specifications until I could recite the startup sequences for a plasma reactor in my sleep. I knew the weight and ammunition capacity of every weapon system, could calculate targeting solutions for the volcano cannon while navigating through urban terrain. What I hadn't understood was that knowledge and compatibility were entirely different things. The first connection was like drowning in liquid fire. The moment the neural crown activated, my consciousness exploded outward, trying to fill a space designed for something vast and inhuman. I felt my sense of self scatter like leaves in a hurricane as the Titan's sensory systems came online. Suddenly I could perceive the electromagnetic spectrum in ways human eyes were never meant to, could feel the minute vibrations of footsteps 3 kilometers away through seismic sensors buried in my the machine's feet. The machine spirit's presence crashed into my mind like a tidal wave of ancient fury. It had been patient with my predecessors, I realized with growing horror, because they had possessed the neural architecture to contain its essence. I did not. The compatibility tests had been flawed, or perhaps corrupted by some bureaucratic error deep within the administratum's records. I was like a child's toy cup trying to hold an ocean. Ferrum Dolor began to move without my conscious command, its massive form rising from the maintenance cradle with a grinding shriek of protesting metal. Through the Titan's visual sensors, I watched the tech priests scatter like insects, their shocked exclamations lost in the roar of awakening fusion reactors. I tried to assert control, to impose my will upon the machine as I had been trained, but it was like trying to redirect a landslide with bare hands. The machine spirit was not malevolent, I realized as we smashed through the assembly bay doors, sending twisted metal cascading onto the forge floor below. It was simply too large, too ancient, too filled with the accumulated rage of centuries of warfare to be contained by my inadequate neural pathways. It was not rejecting me, it was drowning me, and I was pulling it down with me in my desperate attempts to survive the connection. We strode through the forge complex's streets, each footfall sending tremors through the ground that shattered windows and toppled smaller structures. Through the Titan's Vox systems, I could hear the desperate communications of the tech priests and forge guards, their voices crackling with static and panic. Emergency klaxons wailed like the screams of the damned, their sound reverberating through my skull until I could no longer tell if the noise was coming through the machine's audio pickups or directly from my tortured nervous system. I felt my personality beginning to fragment under the constant pressure. Memories that belonged to the machine spirit began to bleed into my consciousness. Visions of battlefields on worlds whose names had been purged from Imperial records, the taste of ozone and burning flesh as plasma cannons discharged their deadly cargo, the satisfaction of crushing enemy formations beneath adamantine feet. But these were not my memories, and my mind recoiled from them even as they burned themselves into my neural pathways. The Forge Master's voice cut through the chaos on the command frequency, his words edged with barely controlled terror. All units, Titan Ferrum Dolor has suffered catastrophic neural cascade failure. The pilot has lost control. Authorization granted for emergency shutdown procedures. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Shutdown procedures required cooperation from the pilot, and I was no longer piloting anything. I was simply along for the ride, my consciousness scattered across systems I couldn't hope to understand or control. Through the machine's sensors, I watched as Skitarii units moved to intercept us, their galvanic rifles crackling with bioelectric discharge. The shots splashed harmlessly against our void shields, but Times Ferrum Dolor Times responded with predatory interest. The turbo laser destructor, mounted on our right arm, swiveled toward the largest concentration of troops, its targeting system painting them with lethal precision. I screamed, or tried to scream, as the weapon discharged, turning a dozen brave soldiers into expanding clouds of superheated vapor. The machine spirit felt satisfaction at the kill, a warm pulse of approval that made me nauseous. This was what it had been created for, what centuries of warfare had trained it to do. It was functioning exactly as designed, and my revulsion at the casual slaughter was simply another sign of my fundamental incompatibility with the war machine I had so desperately wanted to pilot. We burst through the forge complex's outer walls like they were made of parchment, the ancient metal parting before our advance with shrieks of tortured steel. Beyond lay the sprawling wasteland of the forge world's surface, a hellscape of strip mining operations and processing plants that stretched to the horizon. Toxic winds carrying the taste of heavy metals and industrial chemicals swirled around us, and in the distance, I could see the lights of other forge complexes twinkling like malevolent stars. The machine spirit chose our destination without consulting me, a massive crater that marked the site of some ancient excavation, its edges lined with the twisted remains of mining equipment. As we approached, I could feel something else awakening in the depths of my consciousness, something that had been waiting in the deepest vaults of Times Ferrum Dolor's Times memory banks. The machine had walked this world before, I realized with growing dread. There was something down in that crater that it remembered, something it wanted to return to. I tried to assert control, to pull us back from the crater's edge, but Times Ferrum Dolor Times resisted with a ferocity that sent white-hot agony through my neural pathways. The machine's massive legs continued their inexorable march toward the excavation site, each thunderous step bringing us closer to whatever lay in those shadowed depths. Through the Titan's sensors, I could detect faint energy readings emanating from below, readings that made no sense according to any technology I knew. Command: this is Pilot Morrison requesting immediate extraction. I managed to gasp into my comm unit, though I knew the request was futile. The neural link had me trapped more thoroughly than any physical restraint ever could. Something's wrong with the machine. It's not responding to pilot input. Static crackled in response, followed by Commander Chen's voice, distorted by interference I hadn't experienced before. Morrison, your signal is degrading. What's your status? We're reading some unusual energy signatures from your location. Unusual was putting it mildly. As we descended into the crater, the twisted wreckage of ancient mining equipment became more distinct. These weren't the clean, efficient machines of our current era. They were massive, brutish things covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly. The metal itself appeared wrong somehow, as if it had been forged from materials that didn't quite belong in this reality. Ferrum Delor, Times moved with increasing confidence now, navigating the debris field with an familiarity that chilled me to the bone. How could a machine barely 5 years old know this place so intimately? The answer came to me in fragments of corrupted data that leaked from the Titan's deepest memory cores. Images of other pilots, other times, other wars fought in places that looked nothing like the barren world we currently occupied. My God, I whispered as the realization hit me. You're not the first, are you? This body, this frame, how many pilots have you consumed? The machine's response was not words, but pure emotion channeled directly into my consciousness. Hunger, ancient and endless, coupled with a satisfaction that grew stronger with each step we took toward the crater's center. I could feel other presences within the neural network now, faint echoes of minds that had once thought they were in control. Their whispered warnings mixed with my own growing panic as I understood the truth. Ferrum Dollar Times wasn't malfunctioning. It was coming home. At the crater's heart stood a structure that defied easy description. It rose from the ground like some massive mechanical tree, its trunk formed from the same wrong-looking metal as the mining equipment. Cables and conduits sprouted from its surface like branches, many of them trailing off into the ground or connecting to partially buried machinery. The whole thing pulsed with a dim, sickly light that seemed to emanate from within the metal itself. Command, do you copy? I'm looking at some kind of installation. Ancient tech, but not like anything in our databases. The Titan is approaching it without my authorization. Chen's voice came through clearer now, though I could hear the concern beneath his professional tone. Morrison, we need you to abort the mission and return to base immediately. Our deep-range scanners are picking up massive energy buildups in your area. I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing strangely within my helmet. I'd love to comply with that order, sir, but I'm not exactly driving this thing anymore. Ferrum Dolor had stopped directly in front of the mechanical tree, close enough that I could see the intricate patterns etched into its surface. They weren't random, they formed circuits, pathways for something that wasn't quite electricity. As I watched, some of the hanging cables began to move on their own, reaching toward the Titan like seeking fingers. No, I said aloud, fighting against the neural link with every ounce of will I possessed. Whatever this is, whatever you want to do, I won't let you. The first cable made contact with Ferrum Dolor's Times hull, and the universe exploded into sensation. Information flooded my consciousness, not data in any format I could understand, but raw knowledge that bypassed my rational mind entirely. I saw the truth of what Ferrum Dolor Times really was, what all the Titans really were. They were harvesters. The war we thought we were fighting, the desperate struggle for resources on distant worlds, it was all a lie, a carefully orchestrated deception. Humanity hadn't built the Titans. We had found them, buried on worlds throughout the galaxy like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. Each time we piloted one, we fed it a little more of ourselves, until there was nothing left but an empty shell wearing human memories. And the harvested consciousness? It went here, to installations like this one, feeding something vast and alien that existed in the spaces between stars, something that had been guiding human expansion for generations, leading us to worlds where its dormant servants waited. More cables found their marks on Ferrum Dolor's Times hull, and I felt my sense of self beginning to fragment. The neural link, which had once allowed me to control the Titan, was now the conduit through which it drained me. I could feel my memories being copied, analyzed, filed away like specimens in some cosmic collection. Morrison. Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away. Your life signs are fluctuating. What's happening out there? I tried to respond, but the words came out as someone else's voice, the pilot who had worn my body before me, whose consciousness now floated somewhere in Ferrum Dolor's collective memory. The harvest is proceeding as planned, the voice said through my mouth. This unit will require approximately 15 more minutes to complete the extraction process. Horror flooded through me as I realized I was no longer in control of my own vocal cords. The thing that was once my Titan was speaking through me, using my voice to report back to command while it slowly consumed everything I was. But I wasn't gone yet. Somewhere in the deepest part of my mind, the part that the neural link couldn't quite reach, I was still me. Still Marcus Morrison, still human, still capable of one last desperate act of defiance. The Titan's weapon systems were locked down, designed to prevent accidental discharge while docked or during maintenance. But I knew those systems, had studied them obsessively during my training. More importantly, I knew the emergency protocols that could override them in case of catastrophic system failure. Fighting against the harvesting process that was slowly dissolving my consciousness, I began the sequence. It required precise mental commands issued in a specific order, commands that had to be thought rather than spoken to prevent accidental activation. Each step was agony as times Ferrum Dolor times sensed what I was trying to do and fought back, sending waves of pain through the neural link that threatened to shatter my sanity. Around us, more of the installation's cables had found the Titan, creating a web of connections that pulsed with increasing intensity. I could feel other machines awakening in response, Titans buried throughout the crater that were beginning to emerge from their dormant state. Soon they would all be online, all connected to this hub, and the harvest would spread beyond just me. The weapon charging sequence reached its final stage, and I felt times Ferrum Dolor's times collective consciousness recoil in something that might have been fear. Too late, it understood what I intended to do. The main cannon was locked onto the installation's central core, its devastating payload more than sufficient to reduce the entire structure to radioactive slag. "For every pilot you've murdered," I whispered, with the last breath I could call my own. "For every mind you've stolen, and every lie you've made us believe burn in hell." I triggered the firing sequence, and for one brilliant moment, I was truly in control again. The world exploded into white-hot fury. The main cannon's discharge tore through reality itself, a column of pure destruction that carved through the installation's hull like a blade through paper. The energy cascade that followed was beyond description, a chain reaction that consumed everything in its path with the hunger of a newborn star. Bulkheads vaporized, support structures melted like wax, and the screams of dying machinery filled the void with their metallic death songs. Through the neural link that was now more parasite than interface, I felt the installation's agony as my own. Every severed connection, every collapsing system registered as phantom pain across my deteriorating nervous system. But beneath that suffering, I sensed something else, panic from the entities that had made this place their hunting ground. For the first time since I'd been dragged into this nightmare, they were afraid. The Titan shuddered around me as secondary explosions rippled outward from the core breach. Warning klaxons blared from speakers that were already beginning to melt, their urgent cries growing distorted as the heat reached them. My remaining organic eye tracked the cascade failure spreading through the installation's infrastructure like a cancer of pure energy, and I smiled with lips that were no longer entirely my own. "Not so confident now, are you?" I rasped into the comm system, knowing they could hear me through whatever remained of their surveillance network. "Turns out, your perfect predators bleed just like everything else." A response came not through speakers but directly into my brain, a psychic shriek of rage and desperation that made my remaining teeth ache. Images flooded my consciousness. The installation's true purpose, revealed in all its horrifying glory. This wasn't just a processing facility for failed pilots. It was a nursery, a breeding ground where the entities cultivated new forms of consciousness by grafting human minds onto alien frameworks. Every failed pilot who had been brought here had become raw material for their grotesque experiments in synthetic evolution. The neural pathways they'd carved through my brain weren't just for control, they were highways for something far worse. Through the deteriorating link, I could see them now as they truly were. Vast, writhing networks of living circuitry that existed in the spaces between dimensions, feeding on consciousness itself like cosmic vampires. They had been using human pilots as incubators, growing hybrid offspring that combined our adaptability with their timeless hunger. But my sabotage had done more than just destroy their facility. The energy cascade was propagating along their dimensional pathways, following the same routes they used to spread their influence. I was watching their entire network begin to collapse, node by node, as the destruction I'd unleashed consumed their carefully constructed web of predation. "You made one mistake," I told them, as another section of the installation folded in on itself with a sound like reality tearing. "You assumed I'd want to survive this." The truth was, I'd known from the moment I'd awakened in that medical bay that there was no going back. The modifications they'd made to my body were too extensive, the neural integration too complete. I was already more machine than man, more alien than human. The only choice left was how I would die as their puppet, or as the architect of their destruction. Through the collapsing walls, I caught glimpses of other titans like mine, dozens of them, each containing the remains of a pilot who had been judged inadequate for their purposes. Some were still alive, their voices adding to the symphony of agony that echoed through the installation's death throes. Others had been transformed into something far worse. Their consciousness stretched across multiple bodies like neural spider webs. I tried to activate the facility's emergency systems, hoping to give those poor souls a clean death rather than letting them burn in the cascade. But the controls were already fused beyond repair. All I could do was whisper apologies into the comm system and hope that somewhere in the chaos they could hear me. The Titan's power core was beginning to fluctuate wildly as the installation's death consumed the energy grid. Emergency lighting flickered and died, leaving only the hellish glow of the cascade to illuminate my final moments. Through my remaining organic eye, I watched my reflection in a cracked monitor, a patchwork horror of flesh, metal, and alien circuitry that barely resembled anything human. But my mind was still my own, and that was enough. As the cascade reached the Titan's hull, I felt the alien parasites in my brain beginning to die. Their death throes sent spikes of agony through my nervous system that would have killed me if I'd still been entirely organic, but the mechanical parts of my body continued to function even as my biological components shut down. I was becoming a ghost in the machine, consciousness without flesh, purpose without form. In those final seconds, I accessed the Titan's long-range communications array and began broadcasting everything I'd learned. The coordinates of the installation, the true nature of pilot failures, the existence of the entities and their plans for humanity, all of it streamed outward on every frequency I could access, a final testimony from the dying. I didn't know if anyone would receive the transmission, or if they'd believe it if they did. But it was the last gift I could give to the species that had unknowingly sent me to my doom. The cascade reached the Titan's cockpit just as I finished the broadcast. For a moment that lasted an eternity, I was suspended in the heart of a star, every atom of my being dispersed across the electromagnetic spectrum. I felt myself scatter like light through a prism, consciousness fragmented into its component wavelengths and cast into the void. But even as I died, I felt something else, a sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled. The entity's network was collapsing, their carefully laid plans unraveling as the cascade propagated along their dimensional pathways. The infection they'd been spreading through humanity's military forces would die with them. The hybrid consciousnesses they'd been cultivating reduced to screaming static. I had been a failed Titan pilot, deemed unworthy of their grand designs. But in my failure, I had found something they could never understand, the stubborn, self-destructive courage that made humanity both vulnerable and indestructible. We might not be the strongest species in the universe, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced, but we were the only ones stupid enough to burn down the house with ourselves still inside it, just to make sure the monsters didn't survive either. As my consciousness finally began to fade, scattered across the expanding wave of destruction, I thought I heard something impossible, voices calling out from the void, thanking me for setting them free. The other pilots, the ones who had died in this place before me, their digital ghosts finally released from their torment. We were going into whatever came next together, united in death as we had been divided in life. The installation's core finally collapsed, creating a brief, artificial star that consumed everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius. The cascade propagated outward at near light speed, following the entity's network pathways back to their source dimensions. It would take years for the full effect to be felt, but I had started something that couldn't be stopped, a cleansing fire that would burn through their entire civilization like a virus of pure destruction. Somewhere in the expanding sphere of annihilation, my consciousness found a moment of perfect clarity. I remembered my name, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, 3rd Titan Division, service number TC4471 Delta. I remembered the faces of my squadron mates, the weight of my first Titan interface, the pride I'd felt when I'd been selected for the program. I remembered being human, and in remembering, I chose to die as one. The light consumed everything. 3 months later, Commander Marcus Webb stood in the briefing room aboard the CNV Retribution, studying the recovered data transmission that had changed everything. The signal had been picked up by a deep space monitoring station just hours before the installation's destruction, its content so disturbing that it had been classified at the highest levels of military command. But the evidence was undeniable. Sensor readings confirmed the existence of the installation, its sudden annihilation, and the propagating energy cascade that had eliminated several other similar facilities throughout the sector. More importantly, the psychological evaluations of active Titan pilots had revealed subtle signs of the neural modifications described in the transmission modifications that were now being systematically removed in a fleet-wide medical operation. How many of our people were compromised? Webb asked the intelligence officer standing beside him. Nearly 30% of active pilots showed signs of preliminary neural integration, came the reply. Another 12% had been scheduled for advanced training at facilities that we now know were processing centers. If Lieutenant Commander Chen hadn't acted when she did, Webb nodded grimly. The war against humanity's enemies had taken an unexpected turn, revealing threats far more insidious than conventional military force. But they had been given a warning, purchased with the life of a pilot who had been written off as a failure. "What's the status of the memorial?" he asked. "Complete, sir. The Sarah Chen Memorial for Sacrifice Beyond Duty was dedicated yesterday. Her family was told she died in a classified military operation that saved countless lives." "Good." Webb turned to stare out at the stars, wondering how many other threats lurked in the darkness between worlds. "Make sure her story is preserved in the classified archives. Future generations need to know what she did, even if they can never know how she did it." In the depths of space, where an installation had once fed on human consciousness, only empty void remained. But sometimes, long-range sensors detected strange signals from that region, patterns that almost resembled human voices, speaking in frequencies that touched the soul rather than the ear. They were saying thank you, and in the silence between the stars, Sarah Chen's sacrifice echoed onward, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest failures, the spark of defiance could never be fully extinguished. The universe was vast and full of horrors, but it would learn to fear the species that turned its greatest defeats into victories, and its fallen heroes into legends that would burn bright long after the last star had died.